Welcome to our Living Stones podcast, where we gather to discuss all matters of faith and life as members of God's household. In a world that often leaves us feeling fragmented and disconnected, our hope is that Living Stones will further connect us as we pursue the Lord together. I'm your host, Savina, and today we're talking about marriage. Specifically, what helps marriages grow stronger and flourish over time rather than drift apart. This is a conversation not just about staying married, but about what it looks like to pursue depth, intimacy, and faithfulness over the long haul. Joining us again is Caroline. Please listen to the previous episode so you can hear about all her accolades and her positions in life. But I think the most important for today that I'd like to describe her, I'd like to share about her, is that she is a wife, a mother, and she is a licensed therapist. So thank you again for being here to talk about...
Thank you for not kicking me out.
Yeah. You're welcome anytime, Caroline. But yeah, I wanted to kind of have an extension of an episode. The last episode we talked about parenting. And so I felt like it just made sense to then take a step back and have a discussion on marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I know the last episode we briefly talked about how many babies we were going to have, but we're actually going to have quite a few weddings this year too. And yesterday, well, this episode's going to come out much later, but recently we had a member get engaged. So,
yeah.
So cute. And so I feel like, again, timely and hopefully helpful for all our listeners. And although this is about marriage, I do want to also preface and share that this is a great episode for anyone that's hoping to be married one day. Whether you're in a dating relationship or just hoping to be married, this is just all foundational, because I would like to ask you, the first question I'm going to ask you is, what distinguishes a marriage that flourishes or drifts apart?
I love the language that you're using here. Just flourish, framing it as like flourish versus drift. Because I think to me, like that really says that we're not just talking about marriages that last, but marriages that really thrive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, marriages can endure for decades and still feel emotionally empty, disconnected, or lonely.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we're really speaking to this idea that longevity and vitality are not the same thing. The word drift also reminded me of something that I heard in a marriage conference that stuck with me. I think it's the same one that we were talking about.
It, yeah.
But the speaker said, no marriage is static. It's always in motion, either moving towards oneness or drifting toward isolation. And it really struck me that drifting is the default, right? Like if you're not actively, intentionally moving towards each other, then distance doesn't need extra effort. Like it's just the thing that happens. And so I would pause and ask the listeners if they're married, or even, I guess if they are married, which way is your marriage moving?
Even for our newly married couples, like even if you're just a few months in, I feel like you can still ask that question.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you can't really think of anything that you or your spouse are doing together to work on or invest in your marriage, I mean, there's a good chance that like you're drifting. And like the drifting doesn't mean that you're going to be in imminent crisis, but drifting it's just slow movement, sometimes really gradual. Right?
I feel like a lot of couples, they don't realize that they're maybe viewing their spouse a certain way, or how instinctively they're, kind of reacting to one another until it's already done. It's been said and done, and it's been years. And so I feel like that's probably the same just for marriage in general. You can easily drift apart without realizing that you are.
But just pointing out like the danger of the drift, right? I mean, I think that we can always see if a relationship is in crisis, if there's like constant like active yelling and conflict, like just things like that. But I think for a lot of us, it's not so much like the presence of like active conflict day after day, but it might be like the absence of something else, or just like you said, like, parents who are really caught up in a busy season of life and they're just, trying to stay afloat in the daily grind. And, before you know it, like 10 years pass and you feel like you're more roommates than you are a married couple.
Yeah.
Right. But I think, as you were saying, at that point when you are like, shoot, how do we get here? It's so much harder to close the gap. And I was just thinking about like as you're talking about this episode today and just thinking about our audience and our church members, many of whom are Korean or Asian Americans, like how many of us grew up caught between like two very different stories about marriage. So on the one hand, a lot of us watched our parents live out very traditional Asian family-oriented values. And so there was a deep emphasis on, things like duty and sacrifice and keeping the family together no matter what. And so marriage often was permanent but not intimate. How many of us grew up seeing marriages where like just there wasn't much affection, emotional closeness, and sometimes the parents, it's like they live completely separate lives under the same roof, maybe even slept in separate bedrooms. And even their faith, I think, was often deeply shaped by cultural emphasis on sacrifice, endurance, and obedience. Would you say you've seen that?
Oh, of course. Of course. We see it in our parents, and I mean, we sometimes even see it in Korean dramas today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, though, the broader culture, just Western society, and I'll even call out wellness and mental health spaces for being complicit in this too. There's often this really big emphasis on the self, and this promotes a culture of hyper-individualism. I mean, if you consider the language that we use, like, self-awareness, self-care, self-actualization, I mean, not all of this is bad. I mean, there's a lot of good in things like, self-preservation, self-compassion. But I think that when it's taken too far, or if, say, people are overcorrecting in response to an upbringing, like the one that we talked about before, it can lead to this like very consumer or transactional view of marriage.
Yeah.
Like, I'll stay as long as I'm happy or I'm getting what I want. And so when there's a very heavy emphasis on the self, it's not surprising at all when it brings out the selfish side of us.
Yeah.
Right. And I also want to point out that the stories that we absorb about marriage really do shape what we expect or even believe is possible. And so I think that there are some harmful myths and stereotypes about marriage that have been influenced by both sides of the spectrum. And so there's this like, very persisting idea of marriage as like an oppressive institution. Like, we've heard terms like the old ball and chain, or, oh, he's trapped now, or say goodbye to freedom.
Yeah.
And there's also like this like idea of marriage meaning the end of like fun, adventure, and romance. Like, oh, have fun while you still can, or get it out of your system, or just wait until the honeymoon phase is over.
Yeah.
And so the message is often like marriage is where you lose yourself. Marriage is where you lose your freedom. Sacrifice is something to resent, and passion has an expiration date. And so I think just a lot of us have had to untangle these like mixed, conflicting messages about marriage. And we know that we want to avoid the extremes. And so like, where does that kind of leave us, right? On the one hand, at the one extreme, marriage is reduced to duty. It teaches us to stay no matter what, but it doesn't teach us how to love well. And then on the other extreme, marriage is reduced to basically like mutually beneficial exercises in self-fulfillment. And so that teaches us to honor our feelings and pay attention to what we want, but not necessarily how to stay, and certainly not how to honor God's design for marriage. And there is one, right? Like, I think that God has already given us the blueprint for a flourishing marriage. And that blueprint is modeled after like the most perfect love that ever existed. And so if I had to break this down into like a formula, I would say that flourishing marriages are based on a covenant love. So a sacrificial love with deep commitment and deep emotional responsiveness. And so we're pulling in kind of like the best of both of those worlds and stories that we were talking about. And so as we dive into this conversation, I really want to invite our listeners to reimagine what's possible, to put aside the noise and the false teachings you've heard about marriage and allow yourself to wonder, what if the best years aren't behind you, but ahead of you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually have too many thoughts because I feel like whether you're married or not, we all have a understanding of marriage, whether it's from the Western world or whether it's from like our parents' roots. And so even like to now, put down this idea and honestly, this calling of covenant in the midst of what is almost predisposed to us, I feel like it's extremely difficult.
It is. But, like we said, like it's not that the stories are all wrong. I think that there's a lot of good that we can glean from both of them. And so, I think even just maybe this is like just broader commentary on like being an Asian American, like what does it mean to honor some of those roots and, hold on to like traditions or values that we want to pass down or like, keep, but then shaping our understanding and practice of it in a way that's healthier and just more biblically aligned.
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess speaking of like biblical alignment or frameworks, I want to talk a little bit about what covenant love means and what it looks like before we move on to emotional responsiveness and breaking that down into some like concrete learnable skills. So covenant love, I'm going to try to keep this brief because I really don't want to overstep my lane into pastoral territory. But this is a topic that's so like near and dear to me, just because I think that over our marriage, I think that when Josh and I were able to plug into this like idea of covenant love and like live it out, there was such a huge shift in our marriage. And so, I just have a very deep respect for the spiritual framework that we're called to build our marriages in because I've seen the power of it firsthand. And so as Christians, marriage is not just a contract that's built around mutual benefit. It's a covenant, right? And that's a sacred pact where we are promising to choose each other and choose the marriage even when it's really hard. Just, I guess, quick caveat here, it doesn't mean choosing the marriage no matter what. Because God doesn't ask us to follow our spouses into sin or overlook abuse. And so, I would just say that if you are actually in a marriage where you're experiencing domestic violence or abuse, please talk to someone like a counselor, a pastor, and seek help because that's not a marriage that glorifies God. And so a healthy marriage, one that does glorify God, is meant to mirror the union between Christ and his church, right? It's a love that is sacrificial, unconditional, and faithful. And so when you think about the way that God pursues us, like it's also a love that's very relentless. I mean, can you imagine like if we had a God who gave up because we gave him the silent treatment, or if he withheld his love until he felt like we earned it? Like we would not be in a good place.
Oh, absolutely
but he
not.
comes after us every time, right?
Yeah.
And so there's one word that comes up often when we talk about God's design for marriage. And it's a word that I think carries a lot of weight and also misunderstanding, and especially the way that it's sometimes been interpreted in Asian or just like modern culture. And that's submission, right? And like, I think it's very understandable why a lot of people misunderstand what this means, because I think that when we think about submission in like a modern world context, so all three of our kids do BJJ, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? And so
I think all of you guys do it.
I don't.
You don't.
No.
But Josh does.
Yes.
Yes.
He did. But I do want to learn. But that's a separate thing. But like, so in BJJ, like there's submissions. And this is basically when you force your opponent into like a position that is so uncomfortable or painful, they like tap out and like they give up, their power. And it's got names like rear naked choke and like guillotine. So they sound scary and painful.
Gosh.
And so I don't think it's a surprise that like we tend to associate submission with a power imbalance of like losing, domination, silencing, and erasure. And like none of these things are biblical submission. And I think that's what's so important to understand, and is that submission is not about the loss of power, but it's about how we are called to steward our power in the unique roles that God has assigned us. I think that all of us have heard like the command in Ephesians, like wives submit to your husband. But, I think a lot of us might not know that, like in Genesis, the word used to refer to woman, like Eve, is Ezer, right? It's a Hebrew word, and it's translated as helper, but it's also the same word that's used to refer to God and powerful nations. And so we're not talking about helper as in like some inferior sidekick or a servant. Like this helper is a partner and an ally. And I'm not saying this to diminish the concept of headship, which is, very important, but I'm just trying to emphasize that we were designed to have different but complementary strengths, kind of like we talked about in parenting. And so this whole like submission power conversation might feel like a slight tangent, but I'm planting the seed now because I think that when we discuss emotional responsiveness later, a lot of women might be thinking, oh, my husband needs so much help. Okay. So culture will tell us to roll our eyes, look down on men, and demand that they step up. But I think that our faith calls us into a different posture. Like if our men actually do need help, like what does it mean to be a good helper, right? Not to fix or correct or condescend, but genuinely ask, like, how can I be a good partner in this like dance of sanctification? How can I trust God's work in shaping my husband and participate in his process with humility and grace? Right?
And that usually means submitting. Honestly, it does, even in the smallest ways. I feel like when I hear that word submission, I've been at this church for so long. I think instinctively in the beginning, it was very almost offensive. But over time, I did understand the beauty of it, like as you're talking about covenant love. But I also saw that submitting could look so different in like so many different situations. Like submitting could be me refraining, right? In order to give Saints up the space to grow. And so I like that, like that word could, and that concept could mean so many different things, in like not like a slavery type of like connotation.
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's, you're a helper, but like it's a position of just a unique type of power and like the role that you're called to. And like, I'm not trying to single out women, but like, as two women here, I mean, I think we're speaking as wives, right? Like, I mean, the same about submission or what God calls us to do and like the roles that he gives us is also true for men, right? I think that culture tells men to see emotion as weakness and even kind of like give guys like this little wink and permission to dismiss or minimize like, emotional needs. But, husbands are called to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And so like, what does that mean to love your wives well? And so again, like what I'm trying to emphasize is like, don't underestimate the power that you each have to either build each other up or tear each other down with something as simple as a look, right? I mean, if that's not power, I don't know what is. Like I've seen women literally deflate their husbands with just one kind of look of disappointment, right? Like, and so if you...
Sorry, saying stuff. If you're here, I'm working on it.
But it's true. I mean, it's like I've never met a married man who didn't yearn for his wife to look at him like he's her hero.
Right.
And I've never met a married woman who didn't yearn to be cherished or feel cherished by her husband. And if you're married and you don't feel that, like then come talk to me about avoidant attachment styles. But but it's true, right?
Yeah.
And so a few other takeaways in for living out a covenant love, like what that looks like. Because I guess the first we can summarize as just like honoring God's design for marriage, including the roles that we are called into. But I think the second biggest part is like repair is more important than being right. And so every marriage has conflict. And it's not that flourishing marriages don't have conflict, but I think the difference is how the conflict is handled. I think that in marriages that struggle, conflict usually becomes about winning, defending, or punishing. And all of these things create more distance between a couple instead of bringing them together, right? And I think in marriages that flourish, the repair is more important. And so repair, we're going to define this as like the willingness or the attempt to move back towards connection. And so this can look like softening or admitting fault, owning your part of the conflict, apologizing, being the first to apologize.
Oh gosh,
letting stuff go, letting go of your pride. And so from a faith perspective, repair is simply, grace in action. It's humility, repentance, and reconciliation. And so what do you think? Do you think this is easy for people?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, of course not, especially, oh my gosh, I keep referencing back to the previous episode, but thinking about how that could conflict with your values, right? So no, of course not. Not easy.
No, it's so hard. I was also about to say like Pastor Paul's servant today. But I guess recently, depending on when this comes out, like he made a point that we as human beings are much more sinful than we think. And so a lot of us, like if we're like not committing any major like crazy crimes or sins, like we might think that we're okay, but like we all really do have sinful hearts.
Yeah.
And, we struggle with pride and anger. We can't stand it when things feel unfair. And all of these things, if we don't watch them carefully, will take us back to a transactional version of marriage. And so I think another part of covenant love and living that out is this idea of rejecting scorekeeping. And so, Davina, like, how would you describe scorekeeping in a relationship?
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it like, oh, I knew you would do that? Either language like that, or I don't know if it's like verbal scorekeeping, but it's like remembering that this person did this, this, and that throughout however much time.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that's exactly it. Because if you're going to say, like, I knew you would do that, it's because, like, you have been mentally tallying, like, this list of your partner's failures, like what they said, what they did, what they didn't do, and then using that list as leverage or ammunition in the future, right? And so what this does is it really turns your marriage into a courtroom, and it slowly kills the trust and vulnerability over time. I've shared this quote before, but like marriage is where you can win every single battle and still lose the war, right? And we can't forget that all of us get to be close to God because like Jesus literally wiped out the entire scoreboard. And, not that any of us are ever going to reach that level of grace, but I think that in marriage, one of the most tangible ways that we can try to model that grace is to reject scorekeeping.
Yeah.
Right.
But how? But how? Like, if he or she like does the same thing over and over again.
Yeah. Well, so I think that scorekeeping, I feel like the intent matters because if you're tracking someone's fault simply so that you can throw it back in someone's face later, I think that really like embodies like the essence or like purpose of scorekeeping, right? To show that you're the winner, that you're like on the moral high ground. But I think that, if in a marriage, if you're recognizing a pattern of behavior and like that pattern of behavior is hurtful or destructive, there's nothing wrong with pointing out a pattern and having to maybe even cite like specific instances of it. And we'll get to this later, but I think that how you bring up that conversation makes it different in nature and tone than what scorekeeping usually sounds like.
Yeah.
No.
And this is like kind of a tangent, but I feel like, or I'm pretty sure that most marriages maybe have this same issue, which is an issue with Sangsab and I, but at this point of our marriage, like something that we've accepted. And that's the word that I want to use, acceptance. Because if I were to just give an example of how this scorekeeping could play out between me and Sangsab, there's like an issue that I have. It's usually me. Sorry, Sangsab. But I have like a very strong, I really don't like when spouses kind of make the other person look bad in public. It's just a thing that I have. And it's because of my childhood, my parents, whatever, XYZ. But it's just like something that like triggers me.
Yeah.
Sangsab will not have a problem doing that. And it isn't because he's trying to be like, Davina, you're dumb. And again, this is something that I've had to realize and process over time and try to take a step back and understand where he's coming from. Sangsab is just an incredibly black and white, logical, and very honest person. And so it isn't that he isn't trying to correct me, but he is just being himself. And so, however, but I still don't like it. I always tell him, can you just like maybe tell me or correct me after instead of like, I feel like I'm a spectacle almost. And he does it over and over and over and he feels terrible every time because he realizes much later. And so that's an instance where in the beginning of our marriage, I would scorekeep, but I knew you would do that and it would just blow up. But now I've understood that his intention isn't what I think it is. And that's helped me a lot.
Yeah.
But it is really, really hard. Just, coming from an example of like our marriage.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. And I think like every wife or every woman, honestly, I think can relate to that. And so when we were talking about like in the parenting podcast previously, we had talked about like an approach for what like grace-filled truth telling can sound like. And so, I mean, you kind of already just did it, right? Like you acknowledge that the intention is not bad. Like, hey, like I know that you're not trying to hurt me and that you mean well and that like you are just logical and honest. And I love that about you. And then I think the next part, it's like owning your feelings. But I feel hurt, right? Like I feel embarrassed, like when you point out certain things. And then like an invitation for a collaboration of like, is there anything I can do? Because I know you feel bad afterwards to like remind you like we're heading in that direction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And there's a combination of both sides changing too. It's going back to the whole idea of like the Western way or like maybe the American way of looking at a marriage where like if this is not satisfying me or if you're not feeding my personal feelings, then this ain't it.
Right.
But instead in a situation like that, like even I had to participate in understanding and kind of like letting go of some of those feelings and seeing that okay, I don't like it, but he clearly can't help it. So am I going to blow up every time? No, I don't want to live that way.
Yeah,
And so there's like this kind of give and take. So I
exactly.
feel like we're going to talk about more of this later. But yeah, that's just an example of what it looks like for me to
Yes.
sync up.
And I think something that you're naming right now is like your intentional choice to shift your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was going to say, like, as we're talking about scorekeeping, one of the most impactful things that you can do all by yourself, like even without your spouse knowing, is to practice scorekeeping of a different kind. And that's keeping track of everything that your spouse does right. Put another way, this is cultivating like a gratitude mindset. And I think that this isn't even just for like marriages that flourish, but when you look at individuals who flourish, like the people who just kind of radiate like contentment and like they're calm and like at peace
Caroline
with
and
the
Josh.
world.
I'm just a fan. Maybe I'm the wrong person to host this.
But like,
I'm not going to criticize you or
oh,
question you. But yeah, keep going. Yeah.
but like it's the people who notice and like keep track of like the little positive things.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think that our brains are naturally wired into this like negativity bias where we're trained to kind of focus on the bad stuff. Because I mean, in some ways, it's like a survival mechanism, right? You're looking for signs of danger. And so I think that when you retrain your brain to look for the positive things, like changing what you notice can completely change your perspective of someone. And so, Davina, like, I don't think there's anyone who's watching this who doesn't know, but you are an amazing like wedding and lifestyle photographer. And so maybe like you have always had an eye for details, but as you've evolved as a photographer, would you say that like you've trained your brain to notice and appreciate like different things and different kinds of details over time?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Like even just through that line of work, the more you do it, the more you notice, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then like you do it enough and you might not even realize that you're looking for those things anymore. You just see it. Right. And so I think that when you focus on those little things, like the little details, and you compose your image around them, you end up with a more beautiful picture.
Yeah.
And I think it's true the way that we look at our partners. Like if we choose to focus on the little things that we like, and then we build our picture of our spouse around that, it's a much more beautiful image.
Yeah.
Right. And so one thing, I guess, before we shift to the part about emotional responsiveness, it's something that gets overlooked because it seems so obvious. But in marriages that flourish, the couples actually really like each other.
Yeah. That's actually a really big deal.
Like it feels like it should be obvious, but I have heard, couples like, married couples who have been together for a long time say stuff like, I love my spouse very much, but I'm just not really in love with them anymore. And it's said with this kind of like resignation, like, oh, it's just what happens. And this is the drift that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. And flourishing marriages don't settle for that. And that's really where this emotional responsiveness comes in. This is what not settling looks like. This is what dating your spouse forever looks like. It's how we stop taking each other for granted. And it's how we actively make our spouse feel loved, respected, and seen. And so emotional responsiveness, it's like kind of like a broad umbrella term, but it's really noticing your spouse's inner world and choosing to respond in ways that make them feel seen, that protect connection in the relationship and build intimacy. And so this can sound kind of, again, like broad and maybe intimidating, but the good news is that we can really break this down into a lot of concrete skills and behaviors that you can learn. So the first building block is attentive presence. You can't really notice your spouse's inner world if you're not paying attention and if you're not there. And so in a very practical sense, like put the phones away, make eye contact, be present. I think just ask each other questions and be curious about each other again. Because a lot of us were so good at this when we started to date, right? Like we would ask each other questions and like getting to know you. We would make note of things like, what made her smile? What does he get excited about? How does she like to be comforted when she's sad? What compliment like really just made him light up? But people kind of stop doing that or forget to do that over time. But if we're talking about marriages that span decades, the person that you married at year 1, year 5, year 10, year 20, they're not the same person. And so you have to date every version of your husband or wife, right? And so I think that you have to make quality time non-negotiable. And I just do want to say, like, I know that's hard when you are in the thick of it with small children.
I was just going to ask you, like, what is one exercise that you can ask young parents to do to practice this?
Yeah. Well, so I said quality time, and that's not the same thing as quantity of time. Like, you don't have to go on these like big fancy dates with each other. I think that one thing that is very sustainable, there's an exercise from like the Gottman method called like the 6 magical hours. I don't have it in front of me, so I might forget some steps, but it's like it really breaks it apart into like every single day for a week, you do kind of like a small series of steps. So it might be like 5 minutes for like a check-in, or like spend 30 seconds or 2 minutes on, greeting each other hello or saying goodbye. Just finding one thing that you can appreciate about each other, maybe having like a slightly longer, like State of the Union type check-in about how are we doing this week? How are you doing this week? It doesn't have to take up a lot of time. It can be like in 15 minutes after the kids go to bed. But I think it's just, again, prioritizing that, like, hey, I see you as my wife. I see you as my husband, not just, mom or dad. And it's like really paying attention to what's going on in that person's inner world.
So
Right.
attentive presence is possible even when you are young parents.
Yes. And I'm not sugarcoating it. I'm not saying that it's easy. It is hard. But I think that your marriage is too important not to prioritize that in some sort of way,
Yeah.
you know? And it could be just something as simple as like show an interest or support in what your spouse cares about. Like, no one's saying that you have to like all the same things or hobbies, but if something is important to your spouse for whatever reason, whether it's like an issue or a hobby or something, it's like if your spouse is important to you, like maybe show a little bit of curiosity for it.
Yeah.
Right?
Sometimes, honestly, Caroline, it's a little hard because I can't get so interested in the things that Sangsup's interested in. But I know that it's like going back to Eve's purpose. Like, I am called to be someone that supports him and that, like, whether it's in supporting him with love and care and attention, or like in, I don't know, in saying something. But I think that this interest is very important, even if you're not interested. I have friends, like even within our church. I mean, if they're listening, they're gonna know who they are. But like some husbands are super into movies, and the wife don't care at all. They're just not interested in movies. And so it's so easy over time, just because naturally over time you get so comfortable with your spouse to just kind of be like, okay, great, but then that can deflate the other
Right.
side. So
Yeah.
I like this idea of, or this concept.
Yes. And
Yeah.
like, you can do it in a way where like you are still being true to who you are and not like having to fake things all the time. So for example, I think the Super Bowl is coming up. I don't even know who's playing because I'm not like a football person.
Yeah, I just go Bears.
But like, so this is something that like I was talking about with someone recently, is that like the husband is a huge football person. Wife does not care about sports at all.
Yeah.
But what she'll do is like she will like throw on her husband's favorite team's jersey, just kind of show a little bit of team spirit. And, if he invites his friends over, like she'll put together some like, appetizers for the game, just to be like, I am here with you in spirit. Like I'm helping to facilitate your enjoyment of like the thing that you love. Even if she doesn't care, she's not pretending that she cares and loves football, but it's like showing up and honoring something that is important to your spouse.
If anything, it's like that should mean so much to the husband because she doesn't
And
care.
it does.
But she cares for him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
And so, I mean, I think that that's like a small example of how, you can show up for someone, even if you don't care or enjoy what it is that they like. Right. So the next several building blocks fall under the umbrella of healthy emotional regulation and communication. And so, last season we did a podcast episode on communication. And, at the risk of sounding like a little lazy, I'm going to point to that episode just because I think there's a lot of like specific moving parts and kind of technical pieces of what goes into good communication. And so in that episode, we break down like how to actually understand certain emotions, especially complicated ones like anger, being able to identify like distorted thought patterns and replacing it, just the importance of tone and just things like that. So I'm just going to leave that there. Because the first one is managing your own emotions. And this is absolutely a skill that can be learned. And so sometimes people might be like, oh, I thought this was about understanding our spouse's inner world and their emotions. Like, what is this about mine? Well, I think that managing your own emotions is one of the first and biggest obstacles in the responding well to our partner's inner world part. Because a lot of times our something that our spouse expresses when they're trying to share their inner world is going to trigger something in our inner world. And if we let that emotion or reaction run wild and unchecked, we are not going to make them feel seen, protect our connection, or build intimacy.
Yeah.
So just as an example, say my husband is sharing some anxiety and stress about finances. And if I immediately get defensive, even though he's using like gentle tone and being warm, and not criticizing, if I feel like he's criticizing my spending or suggesting that I'm like not contributing enough, like you said before, just because of my own like past triggers, I might get upset and pull away and completely shut down his attempt to share his concerns or even just have an important discussion about future planning. And so all of that can happen if I just didn't check my emotional responses to what he was trying to share.
Yeah. But it also takes time to take that step and be like, okay, let me take a step back.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then like the second part of this, I think, is to be a curious listener, which is listening with the intent to understand. And so this is like understanding your spouse's experience, their feelings, their perspective. And it's not listening just so you can collect information to prepare like a rebuttal or correct details or defend yourself. And so what this looks like in a practical sense is like reflect back what you heard to make sure that like you're not distorting it on the spot. Don't make assumptions about what they didn't say and ask clarifying questions. And it might feel kind of like awkward or artificial, but like sometimes pause and just normalize saying things like, can you hold on 1 second? I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah.
Or I just want to make sure I'm following. It sounds like you're saying, and then blah, 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 like state it back and then say, is that right? Because sometimes the other person might not even realize that how they said something came out so wrong. And you're maybe even giving them a chance to clarify so that you're not walking away with like the wrong message.
Yeah. Also takes so much self-control if what they say makes you mad.
Right. Which is funny because the next part of this is regulating your responses, especially in conflict. So regulation in this context is managing the intensity of your emotions and how they're expressed. So when we start getting into fight or flight mode, like something that our partner is saying or doing is triggering like that emotional or even maybe physical danger response where our limbic system gets flooded, our prefrontal cortex, which controls like logic and empathy and self-control, starts to go offline. What this means is like our capacity to listen with curiosity, empathize, and then repair drops drastically. Like we are either running away or we are fighting. And so this is a danger zone for your marriage. Like this is the space where you say the thing that your spouse will remember 10 years later because it hurt them and you just can't unsay it and they can't unhear it no matter how much you apologize, right?
Well, we're getting into the heart of flourish or drift. I love it.
Yes. And so like take a break when you are flooded to avoid the destructive escalation, right? And that is your job to do. But I think it's important to do this part with intention. Like you have to say, I'm taking a break because I don't want to say something that's going to hurt you, or I need to calm down. Like you can't just storm out because I think that's just going to feel like abandonment to a lot of people and they're not going to know why you're leaving.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is a good spot to point out some of the differences in men and women and how they process, right? And so in every relationship, I mean, not every, but a lot of times there tends to be someone who is an internal processor and someone who's like an external processor. And so in your marriage, would you say that like there's...
What do you think? What do you think, Caroline? Who is the internal processor? And who is
And like, again, I don't want to generalize too much and because there's always exceptions.
Right.
But on average, men tend to process more internally and sequentially, and they need to organize their thoughts before speaking. And pressure to respond quickly and talk it out too soon can be overwhelming. And for women, a lot of women tend to process more externally and relationally. And so they might gain clarity through talking and perceive silence from their partner as disconnection or avoidance. And so this difference can really create an awful misunderstanding loop. Like you don't care because you're quiet, or I can't think because you want me to talk. And it's just you dig yourselves deeper into a hole. And so in this case, like one person is seeking connection and then the other person is seeking regulation. And neither of you are wrong for wanting those things. But I think that if one person needs regulation, that needs to be prioritized to keep the connection safe, right? And again, I just want to emphasize here that these are averages and not absolutes, because like maybe many women are the ones who need space to think, and many men are the ones who just are faster verbal processors.
Yeah.
Because, things like temperament, trauma history, personality can matter just as much as gender.
Yeah. Because even I'm like thinking of like the couples that I know at church, and in that sense, yeah, most of the like verbal processors are the women, but we do still have a few husbands that are more the verbal processors.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so this is something that would like trip me and Josh up so much in like the earlier stages, because I am the verbal processor. And so when we're in it, like I don't want to sit in that. And so I'd be like, we need to fix this and talk it out.
Yeah.
And like, Josh should be silent because he's trying to be thoughtful and think. But I'm like, he's sullen. He's like not speaking to me. He's not being honest with me. And so I would just like poke at him until finally he would just get so tired of being prodded at. And so he would explode and be like, fine, you want me to say something? I'll say something. And then of course, it's not what I want to hear. But like, is that his fault? Because he was clearly signaling in every possible way that he wasn't ready to share and that he needed time to think. And I forced that to happen before he was ready. So, again, sort of like being the helper, like we have to, sort of meet our spouses where they're at. Right?
Yeah. Like we are processing the way we are, but then we have to understand that that's just how they process too. I always tell Sinks up, my grace, like whenever I'm like kind of angry at him at this point of our marriage, we're like heading into our 7th year now. I always go, the reason why I feel better about this situation when I would usually get mad is that I understand that for me, it's so hard to not say anything the way that it's so hard for you to say something. So when I like, try to put myself in his shoes and like, tell myself like for a moment, oh, I just have to like not say anything. That's so hard for me. And so in the same sense that helps me understand that he struggles in the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I love that, because I think that the way you're describing it, like the saying something is like an active response. And I think you're kind of by default, or most people would, seeing the silence as like an absence of response. But like that's the response. And so if it takes you a lot of effort to control this, it's the same going the other way. So I really think that's such an important insight that you pointed out.
Yeah.
But I guess as we're building on thoughtful communication and how to do it, again, there's so many smaller components to this. So I'm just going to approach this from a different angle today. I think culture tells us that we should be completely authentic and honest, right? Especially in our marriages. And I will say, I think there is some truth to this, that like in moving towards oneness, right? Like you're not merging into like one person, but like you're building something powerful and like united that encompasses both of you. We are inviting our spouses to know our inner world, like who we are, more deeply than anyone else. But I think we also have to take responsibility for how and when we share. Because sometimes I think that when we, like in a cultural sense, like say we want to be our most authentic self, we're saying we don't want to limit our preferences. We don't want to filter any of our thoughts. We don't want to check any of our impulses or defaults in any sort of way. And so what we're really kind of saying is like, I want to be my most sinful self. And that's not okay, right? Especially when we know that one of the deeper purposes of marriage is sanctification. So I think in this case, couples in flourishing marriages, like they know how to discern the difference between honesty and brutal honesty. Or the difference between being authentic and this is me, take it or leave it, which is a very selfish and unyielding version of like, this is who I am. Right.
And actually, I've been wanting to share this like piece of advice for a really long time.
Is this
and
the
now
moment?
I have the platform to do it. And this kind of is reflective of even some of like the conversations that I've been running into with our more younger married couples, and then our dating couples that like go into marriage. And going back to your point of being my authentic self, take it or leave it. If you're going to make me feel this way, then like you're offending me, or you should know me by now. Like those kind of thoughts happen a lot when your spouse doesn't give you the response, the reaction, or just the action of what you thought, what you hoped that they would know of you. And so, again, men and women for the most part, like generally speaking, we are very different. And for someone like Saints and I, maybe like a lot of husbands, they're not as expressive. And also sometimes they really just even emotionally cannot understand the intricacies of a woman. And so like a really good example, and this has been like constant for me and Saints from the beginning, because I'm like so good at expressing, I always call myself the heavyweight champion of the world with expression compared to Sangsub, because Sangsub shows his love by doing. And so there are many times where he wouldn't do something that I thought he would have known to do, or say something that I thought he would have known to say. Like, Sangsub, we've been together 3 years. Like, don't you know that when I ask you how your conversation went with, I don't know, Pastor Shiyoung, that I don't want to hear just good. Like, shouldn't you know that by now? But, scorekeeping, right? Going back to that. But instead, I have learned to take that moment and create a practice of telling Sangsub, hey, in these situations, can you remember that, like, I want to know more details? Some couples that I would share this with, I remember like some of the girls would like be kind of what's the word? Like unhappy with what I say because they don't want to instruct their husbands.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to give out explicit questions and instructions for the husbands to memorize, to then regurgitate in like a similar situation.
Mm-hmm.
But I would tell them, sometimes that's what it takes. Like, are you just going to keep getting mad and then jaded over time
Mm-hmm.
because you expect him to know, but then he never really knew? And so like this is a tip that I want to give to couples in any stage of their marriage, where like women especially, like we have this desire to want our husbands to know and understand and react the way that we expect them to, when we never even really told them like how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
and what that looks like for us.
Yes.
So yeah.
Oh, I feel like there is so much wisdom in that, Davina, and thank
But
you
it's
for
hard.
sharing that. It is
It's
hard. And like, you said something a moment ago about like some women might be resistant to hearing this advice or feedback because like they don't want to instruct their husbands or like their partners.
It's not organic. It's not fluid. It's not loving.
Right.
Yeah.
Or like they should have figured this out by
Mhm.
now. And so, like little asterisk, maybe. I mean, I think that if you are going to enter a committed relationship or a marriage, I mean, this is why, like, again, I emphasize like do the self work, right? Because I think that if you enter into a commitment of that level and then you expect maybe your partner to be sort of like a mom therapist partner, I mean, that's not necessarily fair either. But I think that to your point, like, I think that instruction goes both ways sometimes.
Yeah.
I think that you have, like, we cannot expect our spouses to be mind readers, like, no matter how, like, thoughtful they are in other
mind
ways.
readers.
Like, they're
we
not
want them to be.
right. But they're not. And I think that sometimes, like, you have to make your expectations or your hopes or your preferences, like, explicitly known and communicated in, like, a way that's not critical or condescending. So they actually want to, like, learn and do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, going back to this idea of sanctification, like God uses marriage to shape us and refine us. But even God, who literally knows everything and knows best, even he doesn't do it by constantly criticizing us or controlling us. Like, I mean, yes, sometimes there are really hard lessons, but I think that there's a lot of love and patience and care that goes into how he shapes us. And so that is like the way that like we shape, or like that's why the way that we speak to our spouse matters so much. Our tone, our body language, the timing of what we say, the words that we use. And so even when you were talking about like how now you kind of gently pause and like remind him of this, like your tone is so much like kinder, right? It's not, you're not criticizing or shaming or belittling.
But it's right there. It's at the tip of my tongue. And like, this is just to share that like it's not easy to do. But then over time, kind of referencing how we've, even the last episode, how we talked about how we're building this life together, like building the way that we parent together, the building how we communicate with each other. Over time, these things actually do become very natural. And so now, Sangsub actually knows what to do because I am kind of a broken record, but in the nicest way, right? But then at the same time, like it's a give and take, like going back to my other examples where I do take a step back and then I do accept that he's a certain way. And so we hope and we do everything we can to point towards flourishing with one another, which means there's a level of dying to yourself, but then more so there's a level of really pursuing love, like loving your spouse. So, I mean, this is, I love like these like antidotes and like these concepts. It's so helpful.
And I think that what you said about like just learning how to love your spouse, like accepting who they are is so important. So this is kind of like random, but I promise it's connected. Like,
Yeah.
have you ever been to Italy?
I have.
So we got to travel there last summer and, go through some
I saw
cities together.
pictures. They look so good.
And so, well, like one of the places that we went to was Florence. And so Florence has so many like famous pieces of art. And so we were learning about just kind of like, certain artists and history and like saw some of like the big ones like Sistine Chapel and like the Statue of David. And so I learned, like, Michelangelo, when he described his process for creating the Statue of David, he famously said, "I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free." And so, in other words, like for him, and Michelangelo was like deeply religious, like the sculpture was already complete within the stone. And he just chipped away everything that wasn't the Statue of David. And so he was saying that he believed God placed these figures inside the marble, and his role was to like release them. And so he was honoring God as the ultimate creator. And, he was kind of viewing himself as a participant in his divine creativity. And so I really like this analogy for us in marriage, because when you think of an artist working with a chisel, like chipping away at the stone, if you're not careful, like you can shatter it or you can ruin the statue. And I actually learned that before Michelangelo carved David, there were actually two previous sculptors who tried to work with the marble, but then abandoned it because like it was flawed and it became too fragile and damaged, and basically said like nothing beautiful can come of this.
Oh, gosh.
And it kind of sounds like the way that we see people sometimes, right? And I think the way that we treat our spouses is often the same. Like you can chip away at them until there's nothing left or they're broken. But if you are patient and gentle and thoughtful and intentional, like we get to help craft or reveal the image of God in our spouse.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not the image that we wanted or expected, but we are all created to be image bearers in a way. And marriage in this way is a very uniquely powerful space for that sanctification.
Yeah, no,
Right.
definitely. I think something that, and I mentioned this like in like an episode, I think sometime last year, and I'm gonna mention it again. Actually, I don't know if I said it with you or with Pastor Paul in another episode, but a really, really good advice I was given by one of I consider her one of my mentor figures and a missionary that we actually support. The greatest tip she gave me, she actually told me, was to think of myself, referencing back to Eve, as that God created her to be a helper suitable to Adam.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what's also helpful for me when I look at my marriage and look at Saints Up is to not, maybe even how we approach the church, to not see the marriage as consumeristic completely, but to also see that this is a person that's trying his very best, that wants to be happy in his life and wants to live a fulfilling life. And his wife can make it or break it for him. And so I always try to consider that like as someone, like try to look at the marriage outside of being his wife and like looking at him as a person. Like, okay, his wife makes such a big deal in like his pursuit of fullness and happiness. So I feel like that helps too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not to say like that we are necessarily forfeiting like our desires for like
Oh, of
happiness
course
and
not. He has to make me happy too.
But then like I think that when you like, it's really shifting your posture into one of like selflessness instead of selfishness, is that when you're pouring into the other person and like what you said before, kind of like dying onto yourself, the overflow of that, like people typically find that like, oh, I never expected to find this much joy and happiness, rather than like if you try to seize control and like force it to happen. Right. But yeah, like, so talking about communication and like the importance of language, I think that we have to mention like how to learn and honor your spouse's love language. And so I feel like at this point, most people have heard of this concept before, right? Of love languages.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But just to summarize, just in case like somehow you haven't heard it, it's a concept by Gary Chapman. And he introduced this idea that, there's different ways that people can show and receive love, and it's not all the same. And so the 5 that he came up with were physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, and gifts. And it's important because I think that most people have like a default, like 1 or 2 that they prefer, and that like they kind of not only want to receive love, but they tend to show love in that way as well. And so, in a marriage or in relationships, it is entirely possible for 2 people to love each other deeply, but feel unloved. And I think that's really sad. And so there's like a free assessment online. And so if you don't know what your languages are, I would tell every couple to go do it now, and just kind of see if you know how to speak, love to your spouse.
Yeah.
So I guess at this point, we've named a bunch of pieces of like what emotional responsiveness looks like.
Yeah.
And so I want to name the collective impact of all of this. Like, we talked about attentive presence, emotional regulation, being a curious listener, being a thoughtful communicator, and just now loving your spouse in a way that resonates with them.
Mm-hmm.
And the collective impact here by doing all of these things, what you're doing is creating a space for vulnerability. And so I want to share a quote by C.S. Lewis that I think is just perfect. And it's, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. And so vulnerability is the place where I think covenant love and emotional responsiveness meet, right? It's saying that you have the power to hurt me, and I'm choosing to stay and take that risk. I don't know how things will turn out, and I'm choosing to try anyway. I'm letting go of control and taking off the mask. I'm trusting and surrendering to God despite the uncertainty and the unknown. And I think in marriage, vulnerability is how we give our whole selves, our whole heart to each other and say, I'm all in. And really, there's no other way to thrive.
There really isn't. And I love that C.S. Lewis quote, because it's either you give into the vulnerability and you flourish in love, or you end up in a casket, right? In a casket of being alone and then drifting apart. And it's the perfect quote that wraps up flourishing or drifting apart.
Yeah.
I think being engaged is incredibly important. And in order to engage well, to follow all the things that you mentioned today in this episode, is extremely helpful. So I have one last question. For the couples that are struggling, that are discouraged, that, I don't know, have been in a really long season of having a really hard time and maybe even drifting apart, whether they know it or not, what are some encouraging or challenging final words that you'd like to close with?
Yeah. Well, so marriage, obviously encompasses like you and your husband. But I think that especially as Christians, we have to remember that like we're not alone, even in our marriage, right? Like we get to plug into a vertical relationship, and that's with God. And like we don't have to do all of these things, whether it's endure or change just by our own strength. Like we can bring it to God, right? And not only that, but I think that just within our community, like, go to your mentors. Like, women seek out other women, men seek out other men. And so what we were talking about before with trying to understand, like, what is marriage supposed to look like? And I guess in these safer spaces with people that like you respect or trust, like ask and gain insights and hear from their perspectives. Like you don't have to figure it out or pioneer it all on your own. And then also remember that like, even if say, your partner is not on board, because sometimes I think when couples are coming out of a hard season or stuck in it, you have one partner who's maybe a little bit more aware or a little bit more motivated, and someone else who either doesn't recognize the problem or has given up.
Yeah.
And so it's recognizing, again, like stewarding that power is that even if the other person isn't doing anything or is just not in it with you, like you still have the ability to create a change on your end. And I think this is where the grace comes in. Like you're not giving it to them because they deserve it or because they've earned it. You're doing it because like that's what we're called to do.
Yeah.
Right. And so that might be something small, like choosing to notice the little things about your spouse, your husband or your wife that you appreciate, and practicing like the healthy, like loving scorekeeping until the way that you see your spouse is different. Because I think that if the way that you see your spouse is different, you're going to start treating them differently.
Yeah.
And maybe like those tiny little like kernels of kindness or affirmation is what wakes up tenderness or softens the other person, and you started that change all by yourself. Right.
I love that. I love that it does start with you. But yeah, thank you so much for being here again and sharing. I feel like there's so much that we can talk about when it comes to advice and encouragements and challenges for a flourishing marriage. But again, marriage is hard. And I hope even that statement is encouraging to anyone that's listening. It's fulfilling and it can be difficult, and it can be difficult in order to be fulfilling, right? So
Yes.
thank you so much again for
Thank
being
you for
here.
having me here.
As we come to the end of this episode of Living Stones, we hope you've been encouraged to reflect honestly on the direction of your marriage, not with fear or guilt, but with hope. If today's conversation was helpful, we encourage you to share it with others, especially couples who may need to hear that marriage can keep growing even through busy or challenging seasons. Remember, you are not alone. We are members of God's household, united by our shared faith in the Lord and our desire to grow together. So until next time, may God's grace and peace be with you all. Thank you for being a part of Living Stones.